I identify as a woman of colors, West Indian, Caribbean, Jamaican. So I oftentimes say that I am from Jamaica, but my family's roots are coming from Africa, where there was a few people who came over as slaves, but that's not the only identifier. I do know that there are other sides that ranges from Scotland and different locations all across the world. But I know that because my roots are from Africa, regardless of where I end up in this world, I know that that's what this identifies me. A lot of times when I walk outside or if I go into a store or an office, I apply for something, I'm oftentimes identified as African American, and I oftentimes feel a form of discomfort in that identification because I think that people see me and they see my color and assume things of me. Because I'm not African American, it oftentimes makes me feel differently. When I originally came here, I was seen as different from the African Americans, and there are things in their culture that I'm not necessarily accustomed to or I don't practice myself. And so oftentimes when I get confused that way, it does cause me a little bit of discomfort. I think no matter where you come from, your music, the art, the clothing, all of these things are somehow ingrained in what stemmed from Africa. And I am most proud of the arts that comes out of the African diaspora. I am proud of the poetry, the music. Most of all, I think it's beautiful when people of color are able to embrace their features, specifically their hair, and just know that regardless of what they see in others, it is beautiful. It is what makes you who you are.
How do I identify? So it depends on who's asking, but for the most part, if it's a person of color, I identify as Jamaican, but otherwise I'll just say I'm black, especially if it's not a person of color who's asking. So where do I fit in? Obviously, I'm a part of the diaspora, right? My parents emigrated here from Jamaica, so I'm West Indian. So yeah, obviously, it's a complicated question, right? Because if I'm black, I'm definitely part of the diaspora. But because I'm also multi-ethnic, and I was raised in Jamaica, where that's a really big part of your identity. So sometimes I'm conflicted. I'm either, I guess most of the times I just say I'm black unless I'm around my people, and then there are more layers to my identity if I'm around my people. But for the most part, I'm just a black woman who, I'm just part of the diaspora. Okay, so there are definitely parts that, especially when I was younger, gave me a little bit of discomfort, but I've come to terms with it. So for instance, I am of course the descendants of slaves, but I'm also I'm the descendant of a slave owner as well. And I happen to know my great-grandfather. I didn't know him personally, but I'm very connected to him because I knew his son, my grandfather, and they owned slaves. And I guess the knowledge of that is a little bit unsettling because it's these are people, they're a huge part of me and my family. I did know my grandfather and I didn't know his father, but at the same time, I'm also a product of this really ugly part of our history. So that used to give me a little bit of discomfort. No, not so much. That's just part of who I am. And it also helps that a lot of people from the islands share a similar heritage just because of how the history of the island. So I guess, yeah, there's comfort in numbers, I suppose. But yeah, that does bother me a little bit. I get a little bit intimidated when I'm around, say, pure Africans. I used to get very intimidated by people who are pure African because I felt like my African ancestry is the part that I resemble the most, but sometimes it's also the part that I'm least connected with. I don't know much about that part of me. I know more about the European part of me. I know more about the Asian part of me. I know more about the indigenous part of me. But I don't really know who my ancestors were, what tribes, what part of West Africa they came from. I don't know anything about that. But I look the most like them. So, that's kind of weird. Funny enough, it's the same part that gave me a little bit discomfort when I was older. So I am multi-ethnic. I'm very black and I'm very African and I'm very Afrocentric, but I'm also very West Indian. I'm also very much a New Yorker. And I think that the fact that I've got all these different parts that make me up, it's just made it easier for me to, I don't want to say get around, that's not the right word, but it's just made me easier it's made it easier for me to relate with people, especially here in New York City where it's so diverse. Like you meet people from all walks of life, so it's just made it more relatable for me. In addition, I'm married to an African man, I'm a Nigerian man, and the good thing about that is when you marry an African, you basically marry the entire family / village / tribe. They're very community centered, so that's also really helped to teach me a lot about my African identity, about what it's like to be part of a larger community, and I take a lot of that with me as well, so that definitely helps.